We have finished, or you're finishing this week, the first of 4 gospel accounts written about the life of Jesus. And we will come back to another one at the end of week 10 when we start the Gospel of Luke. But between now and then, we're going to read several of the epistles or letters that we find in the New Testament, beginning this week with the first 2/3 of the book of Galatians. The situation is this. The Jewish people had always been the people of God. The patriarchs began this nation of Israel. The law was given to Israel. The kings, the prophets, all of this nation of Israel, they were God's chosen people. Once the gospel is taught to Gentiles, that is non-Jewish people, and they come into the kingdom, well, that causes some problems for many of the Jews. They're confused, they're bothered, they are resistant to that idea in many ways. And so the question is basically this. These Gentiles that are coming into the kingdom, do they first have to become Jews in order for this to work? So do they have to be circumcised? Do they have to keep the dietary restrictions? Do they have to keep the Sabbath? And many of these Jews, you see in Acts chapter 15, their answer was yes. They have to keep these works of the law of Moses. Paul's answer is absolutely not. And so there's a lot in Galatians, but if we can keep in mind that basic big picture question about Jews and Gentiles, and remember Paul's answer, his clear answer, then I think that will help us read through and understand a book like Galatians. Paul comes out of the gate with a very strong rebuke for those that have been teaching this message that Gentiles have to be circumcised, by saying that they are preaching a different gospel, and that if anyone, himself or even an angel, preaches a different gospel, then they are to be accursed. And I think because this issue is so charged, Paul feels the necessity in the first 2 chapters of Galatians to defend his own credibility. In chapter 1, he will explain how he received his message directly from Jesus. His is not a message of men. His is the message from God himself. In the 2nd chapter, he adds to that by saying that once he received his message independent from the other apostles, he went at one point to Jerusalem and met with the other apostles, and he confirmed the message. But then later in chapter 2, he adds one more layer of credibility by saying that when Peter went out of line, Paul stood up to him and confronted him. But notice how in each of those 3 instances, Paul is relating it back to the question of Jews and Gentiles. In the first instance, he describes how he was a Jew of all Jews. And yet, upon hearing the message from Jesus, he gave that up in order to be a follower of Christ. In the case of his confirming of the message with the other apostles, that is in the context of the council in Jerusalem where they got together to discuss whether Gentiles needed to be circumcised. And he says that they wouldn't give in to this false message. And then in the situation where Paul confronts Peter, it is about this very thing. Peter had a moment of weakness where he was drawing back from Gentiles, keeping his distance from them because of the pressure of these Jewish Christians who were anti-Gentile, and Paul calls him out on that. And he concludes all of that by saying that a person is justified not by being a Jew, not by keeping the customs of the law of Moses, that a person is justified by trusting in Jesus and being conformed to his image, being crucified with him and living by faith, and that's for Jews and for Gentiles. Well, then in the next 2 chapters, chapters 3 and 4, Paul goes back and reads through his Old Testament, and he shows how through all these stories in the Old Testament, God has been saying all along that salvation is not through the keeping of the law of Moses, but that salvation comes through that promised blessing that he gave to Abraham all the way back in Genesis chapter 12. And then he goes on to say how the law came later after the promise, and so it does not supersede the promise. And he explains that the law then is a tutor to lead us to Christ. And he talks about baptism as being that unifying act, that through baptism we are made sons of God and we receive the Spirit of God. And so there is no distinction, he says, between Jews and Gentiles, male and female, free and slave. And so being Jewish doesn't give you an upper hand in terms of salvation. Everyone through baptism becomes a child of God and is a free son or daughter. And it is that freedom that he emphasizes at the end of chapter 4 when he takes one more story from the book of Genesis about Sarah and Hagar, and that is an allegory itself. That Hagar was a bondwoman, that she was a slave, and her child wasn't the child that was chosen. Instead, it was Isaac, the son of Sarah, born because of the promise of God. And Paul says we are children of the free woman. We are justified through Christ, not through the law of Moses. And so we should rejoice in the freedom that we have in Christ Jesus. And Paul will go on in chapters 5 and 6 to talk about what that means and what we do with that freedom. But for now, in chapters 1 to 4, we see what Paul is arguing for and how he argues for that using these passages from the book of Genesis.